I built this hands-on lab regarding working with data stores so we could get some additional practice in deleting and creating data stores, both NFS 4.1 as well as VMFS. I also wanted to share with you in a hands-on way some of the challenges that come up when we try to delete a data store that is still in use. Or if it's in a data store cluster, why we might not be able to put a data store into maintenance mode. So we'll walk through all of that together here in the hands-on lab. Let's begin. So we're logged onto the vSphere web client, and we're logged on as administrator at vSphere.local. So let's take a look at our data stores. We'll click on the Storage tab right here in the Navigator pane. And then we have a data store cluster with iSCSI1 and iSCSI2. If we click on, for example, iSCSI1, and with iSCSI1 selected, if we click on VMs, we can see exactly who's using that storage. So we have 4 VMs that are currently using iSCSI1, and if we click on iSCSI2, with the VMs tab selected, we have a whole boatload of VMs that are all using iSCSI2. Fantastic. And if we wanted to create an additional data store cluster, we could do so by right-clicking on the data center, and under Storage, selecting New Data Store Cluster. And let's create one for NFS. We'll call it NFS-Data Store Cluster. Click Next. We'll take all the defaults here. Click Next and Next. We'll select all the hosts in Cluster 1 that should have access to this data store cluster. Click on Next. So we'll select our single NFS-based data store that will go into this data store cluster. Click on Next. Here's a summary, and we'll click on Finish. And ta-da! We now have an NFS data store cluster, and inside of that, if we expand it here on the left, we have our single NFS data store inside of it. So if we click on the NFS-data store and then click on the VMs tab, currently there's a couple of VMs that are using that NFS data store for their files, for their machine files. And as a result, we're going to have a problem unmounting this data store because it's in use. So if we right-clicked on the NFS-data store, and we selected the option for unmount, it says currently there's 3 ESXi hosts that have access to this data store. We'll go ahead and select all of them and click on OK. And then if we click on recent tasks, we can see the progress. Or I should say lack of progress, because it won't complete. It won't have success because it's currently in use. And there's our error message. The resource NFS-data store is in use, and as a result, we can't unmount it. Effectively, we can't take away the data store because it's currently being used. So let's go ahead and click on some other object here. For example, the Las Vegas Data Center. And then we'll go back and click on NFS-data store one more time. And if we tried to put this data store into maintenance mode, right-click on it. And from the menu, hover over maintenance mode and select Enter Maintenance Mode. Here, Storage DRS is saying, you know what, normally what I would do is I would go ahead and move the virtual machines files with either a storage migration if they're off or a storage vMotion if they're on, over to another data store inside of this data store cluster, but there aren't any. So what we could do is say we'll manually do it. So we'll go ahead and put a check in this checkbox, manually resolve the faults, click on Continue, and then if we look at recent tasks, this is going to wait. This is going to wait for us to put it in maintenance mode until we do something with those VMs. We could either move them as far as their storage is concerned, or deleting them would also do it. And for the lab, it'll take a lot less time if we just delete those 2 VMs as opposed to migrating them. So we'll highlight the row for VM-2, and we'll hold down the Shift key and click on the row for VM-3 so they're both highlighted. And then we can right-click on either one of them. And here it says Actions for 2 virtual machines. And from here, we can select Delete from Disk, which will remove them from the inventory, and it will remove their VM files, which are currently being stored on the NFS data store. So we'll click on Delete from Disk. We'll click on Yes to confirm. And then if we go back to our recent tasks, check this out. It deleted the 2 virtual machines, and shortly thereafter, it also completed putting that NFS data store into maintenance mode. So let's go ahead and minimize the recent tasks. And if we click on the Summary tab regarding the NFS data store, and right here it indicates that it's NFS3, it also does not have a little meter right here. If it had a meter on the icon on the summary page, that indicates that storage I/O control is enabled. And the benefit of storage I/O control is that if there's contention based on that storage, and there's not enough to go around, the system can then use shares regarding storage to determine how many I/Os go to this machine versus that machine. And so just like in memory and CPU contention, the shares kick in to let the ESXi host know how many resources or what percentage of available resources are going to be given to an individual VM. So if we wanted to enable storage I/O on this data store, we can click on Configure, and with General selected, under Data Store Capabilities, we can click on Edit, And from here, just add a check to the checkbox for Enable Storage I/O Control and click OK. So I think I just enabled it, but it doesn't show enabled yet. Let's click on Refresh for the vSphere web client. And there we go. There it shows enabled. And if we go back to the summary page, it now has a little icon that represents Storage I/O Control is in effect. So let's take that NFS data store out of maintenance mode. We'll right click on it. And from the menu, we'll hover over maintenance mode. And we'll select Exit Maintenance Mode. And currently, if we go to VMs, we don't have any VMs that are using this NFS data store because we deleted the 2 that were. But if we wanted to bring a VM over there, we could migrate one over. We can just click on the icon here on the navigator for VMs and templates. And let's use a really small VM. So the TC VMs, that's the tiny core VMs. Let's grab TC-02. We'll right click. From the menu for that VM, click on Migrate. And then we'll select Change Storage Only. Click on Next. Select the NFS data store cluster, which will use one of the data stores in that cluster. In this case, it's only one. It's the NFS data store. Click on Next, view the summary, and click on Finish. And because that hard drive is so small, that's going to be done in almost no time at all. There you go. It's complete based on the recent tasks. So now if we go back to the Storage tab right here in the Navigator section, and with the NFS-data store selected, if we click on the VMs tab, there's the VMTC-02. Now, if there is contention for a storage resource, there's 2 ways of modifying the shares and limits that a VM has. One way is to edit the property right here of the VM. So we could right click on this virtual machine, select Edit Settings, and from here we just expand the hard disk, and under the hard disk we could go ahead and specify the shares and limits regarding storage. So we do that right here. Here's the shares that we could set. High is 2000, normal is 1000, low is 500, or we could do custom and put our own value in. And then we also have a limit for IOs per second regarding storage. Another option is if we had a VM storage policy that had rules that specified the shares, whether it's low, normal, or high, we could go ahead and select that as well from the storage policy dropdown, which would be another way to control the storage IO shares and limits regarding a VM. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. So currently this data store is using version 3, NFS 3. And let's go ahead and right click on that data store and let's select Unmount. Please remove it from ESXi2, click OK. And we get the message once again, you can't do that because the data store is currently in use. So we'll go ahead and click on another object and come back to the NFS data store. That refreshes our screen so we can see everything. We'll go to VMs and we'll right click on VM2 and we'll simply do a migrate. And we'll migrate the storage off to another data store. So we'll click on Next. We'll select the, let's do the data store cluster, the iSCSI based one. Click on Next. Click on Finish. Give that a moment to perform the migration. It should disappear from this list. It does. And then we can right click on that data store and put it into maintenance mode, which is great. And because it wasn't in use, it wasn't busy, it went into maintenance mode. And then we can go ahead and right click on that data store and simply say Unmount Data Store. And once again, it's saying that it's in use for heartbeats. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this little X here to dismiss that message. And I'm going to click on OK to continue. And if we look at recent tasks, it is in the process of removing that data store. And it is gone. Fantastic. And if we wanted to create an NFS data store based on NFS 4.1, to do that, we'd right click on our data center. From the menu, hover over Storage, and then simply select New Data Store. We're going to put it in the Las Vegas data center. We'll click on Next. It's going to be NFS, so we'll click that radio button, click on Next. And now, if we want it to be 4.1, and if our storage provider supports 4.1, we can select that radio button, click on Next, and let's go ahead and call this NFS-Data Store. And the folder is /NFS, and that NFS share is being provided courtesy of Windows Server, and that server is at the IP address of 10.1.1.111. So we can click on the plus symbol here to add that to the server list and click on Next. If we want to enable Kerberos-based authentication, and if each of the hosts that's going to be using this data store is part of the Active Directory domain and the credentials are set, go right ahead. So in our case, I'm not going to enable the Kerberos-based authentication. However, it certainly is a feature of 4.1 that can be used. So we'll click on Next to continue. And if we want all of our hosts to be able to use this, we can select that. Or if we just want one host, you can just choose the host that you want to use it. Now, for the benefit of doing features like vSphere vMotion, where you're going to move a VM from one ESXi host to another, the hosts involved with that vMotion, those hosts would need to have access to the storage for that VM, which implies shared storage. So if we selected just one host, that's going to reduce our ability to do vMotion of a VM off of ESXi2 when the VM is using that data store, the NFS data store. So for the demo, I'll go ahead and say just ESXi2. We'll click on Next. Here's a summary. We'll click on Finish. We'll give that a moment to go ahead and complete. We'll click on Recent Tasks so we can watch it. And it is done. We'll minimize Recent Tasks. And if we click on the NFS data store right here on the left in the Navigator pane, and then click on Summary, here it currently shows that it's using NFS version 4.1. And let's do a little cleanup as well. I'm going to go ahead and delete the empty NFS data store cluster. So we'll right click on the cluster, go ahead and select Delete, and we'll click on Yes to confirm. And if we don't intend on using our NFS, we could actually delete that data store as well. So we'll right click on the NFS-data store. From the Action menu, we'll select Unmount Data Store. We'll go ahead and check ESXi2, click OK, and in a moment, that data store is now gone. Now, one thing I've noticed throughout this course is that on the local data stores, for example, let's pick ESXi3's data store right here. So on the Storage tab, we'll click on ESXi-3 data store. That's the local data store. Look at this. It's VMFS version 5. And if we click on another data store, for example, if we go to the iSCSI data store, and look at that, that is VMFS version 6. And if we expand the details right here, we can see that as well, including the number of hosts that are using this data store, how many virtual machines are parked on that data store, as well as how many templates are on that data store. And we can see those actual files if we clicked on the Files tab and then just did a browse of that data store. So going back to the local data store on ESXi-3, it is VMFS5, and at the moment, there's only one host associated with it, which is ESXi3. If we click on the Hosts tab, it'll confirm that for us. And there are no VMs that are using this local data store as their home for their files. If we clicked on VMs, it'll show us that as well. And if we wanted to delete this data store because it's currently not being used, we could simply right-click on it, and then from the Action menu regarding that data store that's local to ESXi3, we could simply select Delete Data Store. We'll click on Yes to confirm, and give it a moment, and poof, it is gone. So if we wanted to create a local data store on one of our ESXi hosts, what we could do is right-click on the data center. In our case, it's Las Vegas Data Center. And from the Action menu, we'll go to Storage. And then from the sub-menu, we'll simply select New Data Store. This is going to be in the Las Vegas Data Center. We'll click on Next. It's going to be VMFS. So we'll leave that radio button selected and click on Next. And let's call this ESXi-3 data store. And now it's asking which host do you want to use to view the available resources. So we want to choose ESXi3. So we'll select the SCSI disk that it has attached. And check this out. Over here on the right, it's showing the sector format. Now there's two basic sector formats. There's 512N, which is the older flavor. And there's also 512E. And with 512E, the E stands for emulated. What it's doing, it's actually using a sector size of 4096, but it's emulating the smaller 512, and that's why it's called 512E, and that's the newer flavor. So based on the backing here regarding this data store, if it's the older 512N, the default is VMFS version 5. However, we can, based on configuration, we can specify that we want 6 instead of 5 when we create the data store using this backing. If our file system is using 512E, the default is VMFS 6. So to demonstrate that, we'll select this disk, click on Next, and here we have the option for VMFS 5 or VMFS 6. So we'll go ahead and click on VMFS 6. We'll click on Next, and here we have the similar interface as we had when we created our data stores from our network-based iSCSI LUNs. So if we don't want to use this entire space, we don't have to. We can go ahead and simply put in a number like 30 gigs, press enter. It'll move the slider for us. And as far as extents go, where we're expanding a data store, one of the things that we cannot do regarding extents is we cannot span over 512N and 512E. So it could be all 512N or all 512E, but as far as extents go, we can't cross over boundaries. Continuing on, we'll click on Next. Here's our summary, and we'll click on Finish. And in just a moment, here we have the ESXi3 data store alive and well and ready. So to test this, if we wanted to do a migration, we could go to the VMs and Templates tab right here. Let's grab VMTC03. We'll right-click on it, select Migrate, and let's select Change both Compute Resource and Storage, because the only host that has access to the local data store in ESXi3 is ESXi3. So we'll click on Next. We'll go ahead and expand everything till we get to ESXi3. And with ESXi3 selected, we'll click on Next. We'll choose the ES6i3 data store, click on Next. We'll leave networking the same, click on Next, and then click on Finish. And again, the problem of putting that virtual machine on ES6i3 and the local data store is that he is no longer a candidate, no longer a candidate for vMotion, because ES6i1 and ES6i2 don't have access to ES6i3's local data store. And I've got a question for you. How could we solve that? And I suppose what we got to do is we could solve that real quick for VM03 by right-clicking on it one more time and selecting Migrate and putting it on some shared storage. And this time we'll just change the storage, clicking on Next. And we're not really using the vSAN data store too much, so we can select that. That is shared storage. That's shared by all 3 ES6i hosts because they're creating that vSAN data store. So with it selected, we'll click on Next, click on Finish, and then look at Recent Tasks, and it is done. And one other thing I'd like to point out is that if we go back to the Storage tab right here, when we created the NFS 4.1 data store, which I subsequently deleted, but when we created that, each of the ES6i hosts that we associated with that data store had a rule set enabled. In fact, the only host that we enabled the 4.1 for was ES6i-2. So if we go back to the Hosts and Clusters tab in the Navigator section, and we click on ES6i-2, and from here, if we click on the Configure tab, and then in this middle pane here, if we scroll down under System, and we go to Security Profile, but if we scroll up to the very top regarding firewall, and we click on Edit to edit the firewall rules, and then I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger. If we scroll, it really didn't help me too much up here, but if we scroll down through the list, one of the options right here is the NFS 4.1 client. So when we enabled NFS 4.1, it enabled that rule set, which opens port 2049 on this ES6i host so that it can communicate with the NFS server using NFS version 4.1. So that's the rule set, that's the port. So we do have options in the security profile of going in manually to modify settings in the event we need to as well. Enjoy the hands-on lab. Feel free to practice and play and working with the data stores, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.